Going to focus mostly on geopolitics. The essay question that I've given my panelists is to think about the next year, all of the topics that we've talked about in the summit, where exactly are we going to go, and we're going to dive straight into it. And I'm going to start with Evan. Evan, you've just flown in from the United States. To be honest, most of the mood music around this conference has involved your government as opposed to the Indian government and what it's been up to. Tell us, how much worse can this get?
Does it involve my government or involves my president?
Your government.
The president. Okay, so the first thing to say, the president of the United States tends to suck the oxygen out of almost every conversation. And that's no different in Washington. He sucks the oxygen out of a lot of things because the administration and the political landscape is very much driven by his personality, but also by his inclinations. I mean, I was a Republican political appointee. I worked for George W. Bush, and the party on some of its positions is broadly unrecognizable, right? I was on a panel this morning. We talked about tariffs. We talked about trade. We went from being a pro-trade party to anti-trade party, pro-business party to slightly anti-competition party. Suddenly we're talking about price controls. So the president's personality drives a lot of the discussion, and so do his policy inclinations. That's a challenge, because I grew up in New York City, where we have something called alternate side of the street parking, where on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can be on the left side, and on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you can be on the other side. And the president doesn't always know where he's positioned. He changes a lot, as he has on tariffs. I think, since the theme of the panel is geopolitics, I would just say, I think, notwithstanding all of that, the United States is at an inflection point globally and geopolitically in any case, because the major conditions that underpin primacy, which we like to flatter ourselves that we still have some kind of primacy, much less hegemony, are either eroding or have eroded. One is being a safe haven financially, economically, commercially. And if you look what's been happening in the markets for the last several days, there's a broad, as we were discussing on a panel this morning, moderated by Ambassador Singh, who I see here, there's been a broad liquidation of U.S. assets in the last few days in ways that cut at this question of safe haven, because it's not just risk assets, but it's safe assets that are trading in some ways as if they're risk assets. And that raises some fundamental questions about where the United States is heading, particularly in the fixed income and the bond market. Second, and most importantly, is the willingness to provide public goods. And to see public goods is something that you provide internationally, partly because it's self-interested to do so, but partly because that's the price you pay for primacy. And what I've seen happening structurally, but particularly in this administration, is that economic public goods, being the demand, keeping the market open, sharing technology, thinking in terms of techno-globalism, not just techno-nationalism, the things that made the United States both attractive and a power are eroding in the policy landscape, but also in the public. And in this region, where the United States was the demand that export-led economies relied on to power their way to prosperity, the whole landscape is different. And then the last thing is that powers like that don't conflate power and influence. They know that they're different. Just because you have power doesn't mean you have influence, and that's underpinned by credibility. And the United States, over the last few years, even in the last administration, is increasingly having to coerce compliance from its allies on things like tech controls on China, transfer of certain things. Why? Because not everybody's on the same page. And the challenge with this administration is it's using power in a way that sees every problem as a nail, U.S. policy as a hammer, and the U.S. is losing credibility as a result. And so as that plays out over 4 years, I think it's really an inflection point in, as you implied, the way others think about the United States, but also, frankly, the way the United States sees itself internationally. Because if you're not willing to provide public goods, then you're not willing to pay the price of primacy, and that's essentially where the U.S. is heading.
Okay, so Ashok, you heard from Evan that, in a sense, the U.S., in a sense, is the U.S. order is crumbling. We began this summit 2 days ago with an introduction from External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. He seemed, I wouldn't want to say relaxed, but sanguine about the challenges that this presented. And out there in the rest of the world, there are a lot of people who don't seem to be as relaxed as people are here in India. So tell us about that. Why, I mean, India seems reasonably sanguine about these epochal changes. What opportunities does India see, and how is it being responded to?
I don't know whether India is sanguine, it's just being realistic. You know, Washington is a very seductive city. If you're in the establishment in Washington, you think it's the capital of global power. If you're in the non-establishment, you think Washington is the capital of global dissent. In India, we just think Washington is the capital of the United States. And we deal with the government and the president of the day. Now, this president has made trade, tariffs, and reshaping the contours of economic engagement a very important part of his agenda. To be sure, there are different views on how that reshaping will take place, even within this administration, between the MAGA group, which sees tariffs as more long-term. It's almost theological about tariffs, and the Wall Street and tech crowd, which is more transactional and short-termist on tariffs. We don't know which side will eventually prevail, or if either side will prevail. Frankly, it might just suit the president to play one side off against the other and ask his interlocutors, including India, to give him the best deal. And he'll pick the best deal when it suits him, and he won't when it doesn't. In all of this, spaces are being opened up in the international system, in the global order, in the trading order, and in broader geopolitics. Some of those spaces which are being opened up are a challenge and a concern. Some of those spaces are opportunistic, and some, frankly, are areas we can use, which is why India is approaching the Trump moment, and the coming year at least, with great realism and hopefully agility.
Tanvi, same question to you. India's response to this Trump moment is appropriately chilled or sanguine?
I agree with Ashok in the sense that, you know, it might seem that it's chill. Some of this is relative, that maybe there's a lot of other panic elsewhere, or, you know, a different reaction at least. I think there are a few reasons why I think India is taking the approach it is. For one, I think there was perhaps a greater degree of expectation, perhaps, or preparation that there would be another Trump term. There wasn't necessarily kind of this view that there wasn't going to be he was going to be a one-term president. So I think there was preparation for that, including in terms of what potentially a second Trump term would bring. I think the second reality is that, all said and done, the US is crucial to several Indian objectives. And Prime Minister Modi said it's an indispensable partner to every one of India's objectives: security, economic transformation, technological acquisition. And so the reality is that whoever is the president, as Ashok said, the reality of the US being important for India hasn't gone away. And so I think what you've seen, and you saw the contours of this in the first Trump term, but you're seeing it, I think, even more now, an approach that has involved invest, adapt, insulate, which is in continuing to invest in alignment with the US where possible, adapting to the new realities of a second-term Trump, with the only constant in the next 4 years going to be volatility. And then third, to some degree try to insulate India from kind of the headwinds that might come through continuing to invest in building Indian autonomy, continuing to diversify and perhaps speed up diversification of India's partnerships with Europe, with Australia, with Japan, with others, with Russia as well, and maintaining that relationship. And then finally, I think, with stabilizing the relationship with China.
I'll come on to China in a minute, but we're looking in this panel forward to what's coming next. One of the things that's happening is we might get a Trump visit to China in the middle of the year, but also we're almost certainly going to get a Trump visit here in India because of the Quad Summit. And so, Philip, let me turn to you as a Quad member. What can we expect from this Quad Summit? And if I might ask a sort of slightly sharper question, under President Trump, one can surmise that he would like to have a slightly harder-edged defense and security-focused Quad. Neither India nor Australia have been terribly keen on this idea. So talk to us about the future direction of the Quad, as well as what we might expect when President Trump turns up in Delhi later in the year.
Firstly, about the current moment we're in, and by the way, it's a moment where Australia is in the middle of an election campaign, so I'm going to be a little more cautioned about what I would say.
I should say this is being carried live, this debate,
That's
so
right.
whatever the ambassador says will immediately go straight home. So.
There's a new figure of speech in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra, which is operating at the speed of relevance. And we are at a moment where being able to perceive what is going on, interpret it, analyse it, engage on it and find responses to it at a level of quickness that has not been required at any time during my career. Look, I just want to say something about some of what the others have said. Look, Mr. Trump won the election on a mandate for change. So none of us should be surprised that change is coming at Washington and that we will have to adapt to it. That's a reality of politics. I think what we are learning or being reminded of is just how salient the United States is in global affairs. Sometimes when I hear people talking about multipolarity, they talk as though there's a group of global powers that are more or less equal. That's not true. The United States is still at the apex of the global order. Australia understands that, India understands that, and that explains a lot of our responses. On the Quad, we're looking forward to the second Trump term. It was under the first Trump term that the Quad began its second journey. Since then, and I was the Quad Sherpa at that point, and I can tell you a vast amount has changed. In those days, the Quad was seeking to become the Quad, in effect. We were meeting at senior officials levels on the sidelines of other meetings, sometimes not putting out a statement, occasionally a few lines. Now we have summits, we have foreign ministers' meetings, we have working groups, we have a whole range of activity going forward. So the Quad has really matured in a very important way. I think what we can be sure is that all members of the Quad are now keen to make it even more effective. It is now well established. It now has a positive framework. We've had, on the very day of the inauguration of the Trump administration, a clear signal that the Quad is very important in the foreign ministers' meeting. But I think what we're all looking for now is to make it even more effective.
Let me turn to my two European co-panelists. Ambassador Ackermann, during this event, my colleague at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Janka Ortel, had a back and forth with Piyush Goyal in which he stated that he thought Europe was currently in crisis. He was referring partly to trade negotiations and non-tariff barriers and environmental regulations, but he was making a broader point. I wondered, before we get into the substance of Europe-India relations, if you might like to respond to that and in a sense, give a sense of where you see the Europe-India relationship.
So let me start by saying that we know the Honourable Minister of Commerce very well. He is a friend of a good debate and is in front of the camera. He can be very, very, let's say, argumentative. I mean, that's maybe the word that comes to mind. I would respectfully disagree. I think Europe...
You don't have to be too respectful.
Yeah, well, I'm ambassador in India. I better respectfully disagree. So I would say that Europe is, undergoing we have some difficulties where basically not alone. You see the rest of the world, including the United States of America, having a couple of difficulties, so that's the reality. But I think when you look at what happened in the last weeks, Europe has shown in a remarkable moment of strength. And I would say that the visit of the President of the Commission and 21 commissioners to Delhi 5 weeks ago was one of these remarkable events where the Commission has shown that they shift their attention very much towards India. I think I've never seen such a visit before to any other country. I think there is a dedication and a commitment to the FTA between India and Europe, and we should not forget it is a time now where those who believe in global and free trade should join hands. This is the time where we should sit together and try to figure out what is possible in the framework of an FTA. And at this moment, I have to say, and the Honourable Minister of Commerce is very aware of this, that the Prime Minister Modi, and the President of the Commission have agreed on a negotiated free trade agreement by the end of this year. Yeah? So we have another 8 months to get through this, and this is a sort of a clear order, I would see, and I think for the next round we'll see whether progress will be made. The other thing where I feel Europe has shown quite a strength is when we saw the up and down in the United States of America. I mean, the Commission has reacted in a very sensible way, calm but very resolved, and I think what we've seen as a reaction has shown that this reaction was the way, the approach the European Commission has taken was quite a wise and a sensible one. So, although Europe has a tendency of belittling itself and also exaggerating the difficulties in which it is right now, I think you should not underestimate the strength and the resolve Europe has right now.
Rosa, given we're here under the auspices of the good people of Carnegie, I should plug a Carnegie publication, which is, you wrote a rather good essay a few months ago talking about a strategic Europe. In his opening remarks, the External Affairs Minister had a line in which he said it was important to India that Europe was a pole in the international system and that it behaved as if it was a pole. One of the themes I've detected from this conference is, in a sense, a sort of growing Indian respect for Europe, as Europe becomes more carnivorous and less herbivorous, India sort of sees a partner it can work with. Is there truth in that? Can India expect a stronger and more strategic Europe as a partner in future?
I do see the signs of Europe flipping the narrative away from belittling itself towards thinking far more sharply about what its actual interests are and what it needs to do to pursue them. But I don't want to gloss over the predicament in which Europe is at the moment, because there is a war in Europe. Russia is conducting a conventional warfare in Ukraine, hybrid warfare in other parts of Europe, and is trying to subvert European democracies. The United States appears to be siding with Putin's vision of the world divided into spheres of influence, so it's absolutely existential that Europe rises to the challenge. And I do see the signs of this, despite the fact that Europe has come through a long period of economic stagnation and political volatility. So what are those signs? The first is taking its security seriously at long last. This is something the Americans have been demanding for a very long time, well before Donald Trump got elected the first time. So that is happening. There are plans to support Ukraine, and there are plans to think about European security, territorial defence and deterrence. And this is unprecedented. So it's quite an extraordinary step. And we hear here in India that India and the European Union are also talking about defence in defence cooperation in the context of the FTA negotiations. So this is something that is clearly relevant for the rest of the world. Secondly, it's courting other countries and being courted by other countries to develop a web of trade relationships so that it can diversify its economic interdependence with the rest of the world. So I think we can see a Europe that is trying to rise to the challenge. But I do want to underscore that the context is a dangerous one, and it is a context in which, if revisionist powers have the upper hand, it's a context which is going to be harmful for other countries that believe in multilateralism, multipolarity, etc.
Let's start this next stage of the conversation and talk about trade and tariffs if you want, but particularly trade. So we have a US-India trade deal that is pending. We have an EU-India trade deal that has to be done, in theory, by the end of the year, when there should be a Europe-India summit in the final quarter of the year. Philip, let me turn to you first. Australia has signed a trade deal with India. It's called ECTA. What advice do you have about negotiating with the Indians?
Oh, first of all, we're not done yet. We've got this first phase of the free trade agreement, and that's very good, and it's working very well for both countries. I mean, just an interesting fact, India's exports to the world have grown by 35% over the last 5 years. That sounds pretty good. India's exports to Australia have grown by 66% in the same period. So, massive acceleration in the character of our trade. What advice would I give? Well, the first thing I'd say, be respectful and listen. Understand each other's sensitive points and be prepared to work around them rather than go at them. Work with the grain. Secondly, ECTA had some elements that were really quite innovative in terms of trade policy activity, and our trade negotiators found new points of contact with India which had been difficult for us to find for a very long time. Third, trust amongst the top negotiators was really important, and establishing a sense that we were embarked on something that we both wanted to get to, and we were prepared to go out of our way to get it and not irritate the other in the time was vital. And then be decisive. Those final days and weeks where high-level negotiations were going on line by line was frankly one of the most active, forward-leaning periods of Australia's trade policy, and hugely advantageous to both countries, and with great credit to those who are involved.
I'll come back to our European friends, but let's do the India-US first. Ashok, can I turn to you? I mean, the outlook for this, I presume, is that we want to have this deal done by the time of Trump's visit for the Quad Summit, but that, frustratingly, is longer than the 90-day timetable, so something needs to be done prior to the 90-day timetable to avoid a potential return of the reciprocal tariffs. So how do you see this game playing out?
Look, there could be an interim deal theoretically in the 90 days leading up to a bigger, proper deal by the autumn, by the fall. But more seriously, if the US is to sign any deal in this 90-day period, I would say the deal with India would pretty much have a very good chance, simply because the Indians and the Americans have been negotiating before almost anybody else started negotiating on tariffs and trade. We have continued and expanded on a discussion and a negotiation that began in the first Trump administration, was not taken up in the Biden administration because trade deals were not being discussed, and was picked up again in February, almost as soon as the USTR was confirmed by the Congress. So when President Trump met Prime Minister Modi, it was Prime Minister Modi who raised the idea of a trade deal and trade negotiations, even before Mr. Trump did. So I think India's been quite focused and astute in this. It's made an offer, which by Indian standards I understand is an ambitious offer. Perhaps it can lead to further negotiations. But if there is a trade deal with any country in the next 90 days, I'm pretty sure India would be one of the first.
Tanvi, I know you're not a trade specialist per se. You cover many topics, but do you have a view on this as well? Do you think this deal will kind of get over the line?
I mean, I'll make a broader point about these trade agreements. I do sense a different attitude from the Indian government on this, at least in terms of rhetoric. We obviously don't know what is in these deals. And you've heard this from the External Affairs Minister in recent weeks. You've heard this from the Commerce Minister just yesterday. His comments in Europe got a lot of attention, but he was very clear yesterday. He made a few points that are worth noting. One, he said we need to do trade, and he also mentioned investment, not just trade. He's talked about that India needs to do more business with the world. But he also specified that India wants to do business in particular with trusted partners in the developed world. And the third thing that he mentioned, and this seemed to signal more to certain parts of, I think in terms of a domestic audience, is that it is become, that certain Indian sectors have become too used to having the domestic market and too comfortable, and that it would actually be good for Indian consumers and things like the Indian economy, job creation, to actually engage in this process. And the reason I think this is perhaps a different moment, I think nothing is inevitable, which is also why I don't think India is sanguine. I think you see that India is not sanguine in the fact that there seems to be some sense of difference from previous attitudes about trade agreements. This government, when it came in, was not keen on trade and bilateral investment agreements. And I think it's a confluence of conditions that bring us to this point. I do think the Trump administration's approach on this is one, but I do think as well the need for additional growth and job-creating growth, as well as the fact there is another thing that perhaps adds to this moment is that politically, perhaps for the government, there is a moment. There's only one state election between now and next year. This time next year, maybe that gives the government a little bit of space, including to socialize the public about these agreements. But I'll make two other points. I think one other thing that I get the sense at least some recognize, if not a number of people in government, is that this is not a business as usual moment for India or the world. This is a moment at the end of the day, I think, this is my view, that we have not seen since that period between 1989 and 1991. And it deserves the kind of reaction, even though it's not a crisis point like 1991 was, it deserves the kind of reaction in terms of understanding there needs to be urgency and agility, and perhaps going beyond that business as usual as India. So I do think this trade part of it is part of seeing that differently.
I'm going to go to our European colleagues now. In a sense, so Tanvi says this is not a business as usual moment. If Europe is to sign a trade deal with India by the time of the summit in the autumn, that will really be a not business as usual process for Europe, because it will mean, in effect, Europe is going to have to sign a deal similar to the Australians, a sort of stage one deal. You can't do a full Europe-style FTA in 6 months. So, Ambassador Ackermann, do you think this is going to happen?
Yeah, I think, it's no secret that the European Union is not an easy partner when it comes to FTAs. Not only do we have 27 different member states with different priorities, but also we tend to go for this comprehensiveness, in the FTAs, and I think Tanvi is right. This is not something we can, it's not the same pattern that we did with Canada or New Zealand or something. It has to be different, and that means also the European side has to adapt to the realities. But adapting to realities doesn't mean, and that's also valid for the American thing, that you throw your convictions overboard. You have to see what you can do. I'm very convinced that if both sides are serious and they are really willing to come to a conclusion, they will be able to do it. That it is not maybe the full-fledged Canada-CETA deal, clearly, but it's maybe more than the Australia deal also. So I think let's see what comes out of it. I'm pretty convinced that I'm convinced because I think now is the moment, actually. Now is the moment to show that we believe in global trade. And I think the investment part, which the Indian side emphasizes, is an important part of this. The investment part is important, and I think it will also come. For the German business in India, an FTA will be a game changer, and that will bring new investment in India, there is no doubt.
More than an Australia deal. This now sounds like a contest between ambassadors named Philipp in Delhi for who can get the best FTA.
So can I say my friend Philipp said that they are not done yet. That's why I can say more than the Australia day on the first stage, because they are working on the next stage.
I like this Philipp-based competition over Indian trade policy. This is terrific. Rosa, may I ask the same question? Do you share the ambassador's optimism? I mean, in a sense, I'm interested in this because were Europe, in a sense, to compromise on its traditional FTA model in order to do a trade deal with India at an accelerated timescale, it would be a real indicator of the kind of geopolitical impetus and a change in approach from Europe. And so, do you think it'll happen?
Well, let's be honest, the shift away from comprehensive trade deals that included everything on climate, on labour standards, on health and safety was already happening. Europe wasn't getting its way and was receiving a lot of pushback from countries around the world, but also from Europeans who were, protesting against, for instance, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and against the agreement with with CETA. So I think we were in that space anyway. So what is important? Number one is to lock in relationships through trade. Number two, to continue the conversation on all those things that might not get in the trade agreement, but that are important. And I do think Europe has a special role to play, together with others, in supporting what we call global commons or global public goods, which are very much related to climate, related to technology, related to all those trends that escape state control. Because what we have is a trend in which several states are trying to maintain and extend national control undemocratically, and we have a number of trends that go beyond states and that need to be regulated. And I think the EU definitely, and European countries, are in that camp of countries that want to think about global commons together with others. So I think that's the sort of way in which a thinner FTA can be compensated through different types of conversation.
Excellent. You may not see this, but I can see it. There's a clock ticking down at the front. We're now halfway through our time, and I've been given very strict instructions by Rudra Chaudhry that we're to end precisely on time. I want to ask about China, and I also want to ask about the opportunity for India, and we'll see if we can squeeze in a couple of audience questions as well. But first I want to go to Evan, in a sense, to talk about the balance between the US and China in the region. We face a curious next year because, in one sense, the US is going to be at the very center of Asian economic diplomacy. It's going to be negotiating with India, with Japan, with everybody else. At another level, it seems that the US is really abdicating its role as a leader in Asia, and you have this wonderful phrase where you have warned against the United States becoming the Hessians of Asia. I wonder, could you explain what you mean by that, and in a sense, what game you think the US is playing in terms of economic statecraft at the moment?
Yeah, I can explain that. I mean, to explain it gets at actually the way the region is changing, and whether and how the U.S. is adapting. And as is implicit in my use of the phrase, the U.S., in my view, is not really adapting. If you think about why the United States was a leader in Asia, by which I really mean East Asia, in the post-World War II period, but particularly after the 1960s, it was because it was the principal provider of both security-related public goods and economic-related public goods and other benefits. And in the security realm, because everybody's largely afraid of you-know-who.
We'll get to them in a minute.
Okay. I mean, just to be blunt about it, most countries in the region are scared of China. And because they're scared of China, the United States is, and for much of the region will continue, as far as my eyes can see, to either be a direct security provider or an indirect security provider through the security-related public goods that it provides through things like alliances, forward-deployed military presence, carrier battle groups. In other words, we sail boats and fly planes around, and we're good at it. And that's both instrumentally and strategically useful in the region. But that was never the end of the story for the United States in the region. The United States was also a leader here because it was an economic public goods provider, not least by, as I said earlier in answer to your first question to me, by being, for example, the demand that kept its market open to Asia's export-led economies that powered their way to prosperity on the back of American demand. And the United States was a standard setter. So there's no basis for collective security in East Asia until China and Japan have a moment analogous to France and Germany in Europe. And that being the case, as I said, the United States will be the principal provider of security directly or indirectly for most countries not called China. But on the economic side, the U.S. demand profile, I'm sorry, it's shrinking in the region. U.S. trade with every country in Asia is going up in absolute terms. It's declining everywhere in relative terms. And there's much more intra-Asian trade, and the region is becoming more Asian and less Pacific. And if that's happening for structural reasons, then if you want to continue to play that economic role, you need to fall back on the other pillar, which was to be a standard setter, rule writer, and norm giver. But what we've seen over the last decade or so is the United States progressively withdrawing from that role. The U.S. pulled out, there are 3 trade agreements, for example, since we were talking about trade agreements. in that part of the world that set standards, the CPTPP, the RCEP, the DIPA. The United States is on the outside of not one, not two, but all three of them. Now, to go to your direct question, and then I'll stop, does that mean the region is bipolar between the U.S. and China? No, because everybody's still afraid of China, but also because there are a lot of large, capable, self-interested countries in Asia, including but not limited to India, also Japan, South Korea, Australia, that have something to say about the way the region is going to shape up and have power and capacity that they can bring to problems. And so you see that on things like trade rules, but also on functions that really matter. Online authentication and data access control, project finance, cross-border investment. There's lots of Japanese money flowing around the region. And so that being the case, the region is not really bipolar. It's heading for something that's more like fragmentation, where on different functions, different coalitions of countries are going to drive the rules. And CPTPP is the best example of that. Right? President Obama said the U.S. has to be in CPTPP. Why? Because if we don't write the rules, China's going to write the rules. He literally said it. It's a verbatim quote. So that's bipolarity. But that's not what happened. When President Trump took the U.S. out of TPP, China did not come in and write the rules. Instead, the other 11 got together, solidified the agreement, and neither the United States nor China was party to the agreement. So that to me suggests, I don't know if you want to call it multipolarity, I call it kind of fragmentation, diversity. The United States needs to be adaptive to that Asia. And what I meant by Hessians was I see the U.S. abdicating the standard-setting role, shrinking in the demand role. It's being exacerbated by protectionism in the United States, and we don't want to end up in a position where we're basically just the security provider sailing boats and flying planes around. Because what that means is the region will become more Asian and less Pacific on functions that actually matter to American interests. And I think that's a trend line that's concerned me for 15 years. It's not specific to Trump. And it really goes back, if I'm going to be blunt about it, to the Asian financial crisis in the 90s. So that's what.
So we'll come to you-know-who in a minute, but Philip, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I did. I'm very glad that Evan believes that the United States will continue to be a key security provider in the Indo-Pacific, and I totally agree with that. And I'm glad, but it is true, of course, that Australian governments, as a matter of long history, have sought the US's deeper engagement with the trade and economic affairs of our region. And it was a disappointment to us when the US removed itself from TPP. But look what happened. At that moment, everyone thought it was dead. Everyone thought it was over. And it was Japanese and Australian diplomacy that resuscitated it. I know, but Australian... And this moment is a moment where we will need more of that diplomacy by those parts of the region. But I want to make another point. So we are here at the Global Technology Summit. And if the United States isn't operating in terms of regional trade in the way in which we would be best pleased, we are seeing the United States step forward in relation to regional technology issues. And first with ISET and now with Trust, we are seeing sequential US governments focused on this core area for strategic balance in the region, and that is to be applauded.
Let me ask about China. In a sense, there are three relationships here, and my sense is everyone is nervous about everybody else. So the Europeans are worried that India and China are going to get closer. The Indians are worried that Europe and China are going to get closer. And everyone's worried that the Americans may do a deal with the Chinese, even in unexpected scenarios. So in a sense, who's right? Let's start with India. Tanvi, do you see, we see a sort of moderation, I think it's fair to say, and normalization at a low level of India-China ties. Is something more than that possible over the coming year?
You know, I don't think we've seen, and I think you've heard a number of folks say this, is you have seen an effort to stabilize ties, seeing what's possible. Have developments in the U.S. contributed to it? Yes, but there are also contributions in terms of the broader strategic and economic pressure that Beijing was facing, perhaps. Some calls for kind of some selective re-engagement here, economic re-engagement here. So you did see this process, which, by the way, was not a post-U.S. election process. You have seen China and India. I saw signs from almost a year ago that an agreement was possible, and to disengage. So I think you have seen the beginnings of a process, and the way that it was put is getting the path to normalization has opened up, and now the two sides have to walk it. And seems to be the countries seem to be taking that on a step-by-step basis, or at least that seems to be India's preference. You still hear sometimes from Beijing that we've sorted that out, now let's just focus on the relationship. And you are seeing a Beijing that every day, and you see this on the a couple of the Chinese embassy accounts here, you're seeing it repeatedly, this sense of actually trying to say that one of the reasons India and China should do more together, including in Asia, is because look at what the US is doing. India is not taking that bait, and I think one of the reasons you're seeing India not taking that bait is it is structurally still a rivalry. There is you have not seen any changes in the kind of structural problems that the two countries have. For every sign or meeting that you have, you are seeing those competitive instincts between the two countries. So are we going to see more? Yes, we might see more steps. I think it depends on whether both sides think they're getting from this dialogue what they think is going to get them to move forward. But I think, and you could even see the topic of economic ties have come up. I've said before, I think there will be certain areas there will be selective economic re-engagement. I think the minister was clear yesterday. He does not see India joining RCEP, for example, or having that deep trade or at least investment relationship with China that some would like. But nonetheless, I do think you've already seen some signs of that. But I do not see, unless China makes an offer to India to take it off the table in some ways and changes its behavior radically, that you are going to see a massive shift. One other thing that just worries, when you talk about people worrying about relation, the thing that people used to worry about when they saw China and India talking in the US, elsewhere, was that if China and India were getting along, or because India was concerned about provoking China, it would stop doing things with the US, with the Quad and others. We have not seen any signs of that, or any major signs of that in the last few months, even as India has been on this normalization process.
Ashok, same question to you, but in a slightly different way. We saw, again, my colleague Anka's interview with Piyush Goyal. He again sort of appeared to rule out BYD investment in India, said he preferred India doing business with developed economies rather than China. Nonetheless, there are two areas in which sort of India and China have an incentive to become more entwined. One is manufacturing, where Chinese imports are necessary and FDI is necessary. There's been a debate about that. The other is the green transition, where it is tempting to meet green transition targets using Chinese technology, batteries, turbines. In a sense, is it possible to have a China-free supply chain for India?
In some cases, no. In some cases, frankly, we just have to. I'll give you one example of an area where a China-free supply chain is and was possible for all our countries: COVID vaccines. I worked on it when I was in the ministry. And you either had a China supply chain COVID vaccine, or you had a non-China supply chain COVID vaccine involving India, Australia, Poland, America, all countries. Anyway, that's besides the point. How does India approach China? Look, it's complex. China is India's largest trading partner in most years. In some years, it's the United States. China is a very significant economy. It's not going to go away. To boycott China is to punish Indian consumers. If my daughter wants to buy a laptop to do homework, chances are she'll buy something made in China, even if it has a US brand or a Japanese brand. Indian manufacturing, as it grows, as it advances, will need more and more cooperation with China, more equipment from China, more ingredients from China, more machines from China. The more iPhones we make, the more components we import. Having said that, and perhaps that should continue even faster than it is. Having said that, there are other areas where China remains a concern. One, the political relationship is still too poor, and I suspect will remain too poor, for Chinese companies to be allowed into public procurement in India. That's over. Second, India's economic transformation is coinciding with the digital moment. And digital technologies pose pose risk of permeation, of infiltration in a way traditional technologies did not. So if you look at electric vehicles, which are data ingesters, if you look at AI, if you look at semiconductors, if you look at quantum computing, if you look at advanced biology or biotech, frankly, it's not just a question of diversification from China, it's a question of decoupling. And if that means greater short-term cost, they'll have to be borne. In telecom, we had to bear that. We kept out Huawei. The European companies, which were not as inexpensive, gained. Finally, India is very conscious and sensitive to dumping by China in not just in high-end goods, but also in low-end goods. Where the reason we did not sign onto RCEP is because our experience with trade deals with countries to our east, ASEAN countries broadly, in the early 2000s, led to a situation where eventually all supply chains seemed to lead to China, and Chinese goods were flooding our markets. Not just Chinese electric vehicles and semiconductors, but Chinese frying pans. And that poses not just an economic challenge to India, but also a social dislocation.
Let me ask the same question to our European guests. First to Rosa at the European level, and then second to Philipp at the German level, given you have a new government. Again, everyone is worried about relations between their own country and China. I mean, in a sense, is Europe also going to go through a moment of normalization with China, do you think?
I think Europe has shifted considerably on China, and it's not just because the Biden administration pushed it in that direction. It's because of China's behavior. I mean, Europe really has an issue with the lack of reciprocity and has been developing a whole set of tools to protect its economic security, while at the same time differentiating itself even from the Biden administration, which is a friendly administration in the sense that it has always argued that on certain issues it does want to talk with China. And I actually think that that position will be maintained, that Europeans, yes, there was a phone call the other day about how to handle the tariffs between the President of the Commission and the Prime Minister, but that was of China, but that was to avoid China flooding the European market with cheap goods. So I think that balance will be maintained. And there's a paradoxical reason for which that balance will be maintained, and that is that actually European countries disagree quite a lot on how to deal with China. They have quite different types of dependencies with China. Some are dependent on China for exports, others for imports or FDIs, etc. But precisely because there is that diversity, it's actually very hard to have a single hawkish position. So I think that is my expectation, that at least that there will be an attempt to keep that distance and to keep focused on economic security and on and a balance between economic security and free trade and global commons, etc.
Philipp, you have a new government, you have a new chancellor. The chancellor is from a centre-right party that traditionally has had a strong relationship with business. German business is generally very keen on doing business with China. On the other hand, your new chancellor has been quite outspoken. The new coalition agreement signed recently seems to be reasonably robust on Germany's position with China. Can you give us a sense of Germany's position on this?
I think it's wonderful that everybody thinks we have a new government. We don't, actually. But, you know, Germany is so reliable that you think we have a new government, and everybody
will soon have a new government.
In a couple of weeks, 2 weeks maybe. But I think I can say with some conviction that, you know, the position of Germany when it comes to China will not change. I think one should not get confused that we are now together with China against some power that wants to unwind the global trade and global business. Doesn't mean that we think that China is a better partner through this. I think we have the same problems with China like we had before, and I think Rosa is completely right when she says there is a growing discomfort in Europe, and when it comes to my government, we have always seen, these 3 steps: China as an economic partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And when you read this coalition contract paper, you'll find that the systemic rival is very, very strongly emphasized in this. So basically, I think for us, we will continue this what we call the de-risking strategy. Yeah? We will try to encourage German business to go elsewhere, not to put all their eggs in one basket. And India is an important country in this encouragement, and I'm coming back to what I said before, is a good reason to have a very solid free trade agreement.
Very good. So we've heard from our panel that we, in a sense, have a moment of profound geopolitical change. We also have only 10 minutes to go in our own panel, and I would like to I want to close by asking each of my panelists what the opportunity is for India. So you can all think about at least one thing that it should be an opportunity for India. But I would like to just take a couple of audience questions. Let me see, whose hand did I see go up first? So, sir, I'm only going to take a couple because we don't have a huge amount of time, and then I'll go over to this, the gentleman in the front here. If you'd introduce yourself, and I humbly request very brief questions with a question mark at the end, not a long-winded contribution. Sir.
My name is Akash. I am a researcher in science and technology policy, and I am a student of geopolitics also. My question is to Evan. How do you see the future of alliance politics with the recent happenings that have been there with the unilateral measures? And what role does the non-state actors like private companies or say tech giants play in those alliances? And how do you see the future of alliance politics?
Okay, well that's a very narrow question, Evan. You're only going to have a minute to answer that. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Yogendra Kumar, former ambassador. The question actually I have for the panel really is this, that in the entire discussion here, but I find it generally discourse in geopolitics and power equations and all that, the issue of climate change, global warming, is completely missing. And the fact that nowadays the reports are coming that by the end of the century, I think the temperature will cross about 3 degrees centigrade. And the stress being caused by this phenomenon, growing phenomenon, on the internal situation in all countries is actually aggravating internal situations, causing stress on the systems. So, in fact, now the report about that, in terms of insurance policies for housing and so on and so forth, is going to already starting to cause problems. The question really is this, that aware of this kind of menacing threat, which actually has already started, everybody is feeling it, in our neighborhood, India, everywhere. Are we going to revisit the entire outlook towards power equations? Are we going to think about international relations a little differently?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to take one more, you sir at the back. I was looking for, anyway, there we go. One, and that's it. Sorry, I did see other hands, but I can't take all of them. Again, identify yourself.
Thanks, James. This is Rahul. I work at the intersection of tech and geopolitics. You mentioned the profoundness from the panel. Blessed to have a panel like this at the end of the day, but, maybe it's a sign of the times that everyone's been talking about economic interests and transactional relations, and no one's really touched upon the 3 major conflicts from my perspective anyway, because I spent a lot of time in Myanmar, so I count that as a 3rd conflict. There's tens of thousands of people dying in Ukraine, in Gaza, and in Myanmar. But no one on the panel has touched that at all.
Okay.
I'm not saying, but I guess the question then is, where does that feature in the geopolitics of the next year? Where does that feature in the alliances of the world? Is there a binary solution to it, considering we are in a tech conference where things can get binary?
Okay. All right. Now, panelists, you have about a minute each before we run out of time, so this is going to be difficult. Evan, you had a specific question about alliance politics, and I'd also like an opportunity for India thought from you as from everyone else. So why don't you go first?
You want me to do both of them? Okay. I can't address all aspects of the alliance question because you threw in business and civic groups. Why don't I just focus at the strategic level? First point, it's just a fact. The United States is currently introducing a lot of stress into its alliance relationships. It's a fact. And it's intellectually unserious to pretend otherwise. I think it's a little less salient in Asia, and it's manifesting itself in Asia differently than in Europe. But the problem is that the United States is increasingly China-centric in its approach to the region, and that's going to stress these alliances in a different set of ways. I'll be quick, I promise. I work for a guy named Rich Armitage. He was Deputy Secretary of State Rich had a famous saying. He said, if you want to get China right, you got to get Asia right. But the U.S. has kind of flipped that. Increasingly, we're making every relationship policy initiative in Asia derivative of the focus on China. And the fact is, American allies have not securitized their approaches to China, particularly on the economic side, to the degree the U.S. has. And that's going to stress these because it means the U.S. is going to have to coerce compliance by extraterritorializing things like export controls, investment restrictions, and so on. And so that's going to be layered on top of the fact that the five treaty allies for the U.S. and the region are not entirely on the same page, either on China or on regional order. Thailand's not Japan. Japan, not even Australia. So that's a short answer. On India, my thing would be to say, when I first started coming to India, everybody in the United States used to say India was this place that needed to be reformed. So it was like India was this object that needed to be reformed. But if you've sat through this conference, as I have for a lot of years, all sorts of interesting stuff is happening in India, like all the stuff that Rudra's doing on DPIs, where India's developing models and innovating things that actually can be exported and scaled and that can be a model for other parts of the world. So to me, that's the opportunity, right? Like if I'm sitting in Africa or the Middle East, or I'm thinking about bringing people into the organized financial system, the United States doesn't really have much to offer compared to India in terms of ideas that have been pioneered here. So you go from object to subject, and India exporting its reform story and its own innovation story is, to me, that's where the opportunity.
Philip, I don't know if you want very briefly to pick up the excellent climate change point and also give us an opportunity for India as well.
So super briefly on both the questions about regional conflicts and about climate change. The reality is we live in a time of great power contestation. And that makes it harder for the global community and us diplomats to eke out enough time and space to deal with the regional problems and this huge generational problem of climate change. I don't have the answer to that. All I can say is that the word that jangles around our system, reverberates around our system, is agency. That countries of the size of Australia need to engage with utmost agency to do what we can to try to resolve these problems as great power contestation flows through.
Opportunity for India?
Reform.
Okay. Let me go to Rosa. I wonder if you would like, you had a mention of Ukraine. I thought you might want to say a word about that, and again, an opportunity for India in this moment.
Well, I mean, there's one thing, there's, I can sense quite a bit of glee at the decline of the United States as a hegemonic power, but I think we should remember that with hegemony comes responsibility. So if power is diffused towards a multilateral order, that means that these poles of the global relations need to take responsibility. And I think the responsibility really has to be towards peace and addressing conflicts. And you mentioned there's also Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar. It's only getting worse because great power rivalry encourages adventurism on part of regional actors, middle-sized actors, and climate. I mean, there is a planet that ought to be, at least needs to adapt to the reality of climate change. So I think for India as well, the idea of thinking about what kind of responsibility it can take on its shoulders so that it can have a greater say in global affairs, and how, together with other allies, it can work in the international organizations that at the moment are pretty much bankrupt. How can we work together to address those global commons? That, to me, is an opportunity for India as well.
Ambassador
Can I
Ackermann.
just jump in, because I think it's exactly what my point would have been. It's an India moment right now. The world is looking with great sympathy and great positivism at India. I would even say India is courted, generally speaking, and that means that this India moment can be used in a way that India is a proactive partner, a popular partner in the international setup. And I want to quote one specific example because it was mentioned. India was, at the end of COP, Baku, basically isolated. And it is very strange that, it was alone. And I would hope that India now, in this context, gets a more constructive and more proactive negotiation approach, and it is more sort of constructive at the table. I think that would be the India moment I would wish for.
And so, Ashok and Tanvi, as in a sense, India specialists, can you give us an opportunity for India to close? Maybe Ashok first and then Tanvi. Okay, Tanvi first and then Ashok. Don't be too modest.
I'm going to use an Americanism. If you build it, they will come. And yesterday, Nandan Nilekani pointed out that the things India needs to do, it's not about what's going on about our internal. And if India builds the environment, capital is looking for places, countries are looking for partners, the region is looking for leadership. If India offers it, India will have that opportunity.
Ashok, final word to you.
Well, what will India do in the coming year? Quite honestly, hunker down, look inwards, show great urgency, long overdue, in signing trade deals with compatible partners such as the US, the EU, New Zealand, the UK. These are not trade deals that really threaten India in a way a trade deal with China would. I think there's great keenness and urgency to actually do those. Second, in a world which is perhaps moving towards spheres of influence and regions of influence, and certainly more great power competition, India needs to work much more closely with its immediate neighbors, because great power competition is coming very, very, very close to our borders.
Very good. This has been a fantastic event, and I think this has been a fantastic panel, so please give my panelists a big round of applause. Thank you very much for a great discussion. And I think this marks the end of the event. I will hand back to our hosts at Carnegie if someone wants to close, otherwise we will draw proceedings to a close. There we go. Thank you very much.